Hey there, it's Chris from Good Roads, and in this video, we're gonna press a snowboard. But there's just one little issue that I gotta take care of and fix from my prep work last time before we get started. So let's take a quick look. The sidewalls that I poured into my core are just a hair too narrow, and the edges of my base overlap them. This means that when I go to cut out my board, it will very likely have wood exposed on the sides instead of my nice urethane sidewalls. So I took a long straight edge and cut a strip from the center of my base sheet. I got my two halves positioned so that the edges line up with the sidewalls right, and measured the gap. Then I cut myself a pinstripe from some spare base material I had around. And I used packing tape to hold these three pieces of my new base together. Since it's plastic, I should be able to peel it right off after the layup. Great, and with that, we're looking much better, and since we mentioned the layup, let's get on to it. This time around, I'm gonna seat my bindings ahead of time, which should save me precious moments while I'm getting everything together in the mold. I've also moved up and out of the shop and into my kitchen because my shop is colder than the working temperature of my resin, and I wanna make sure my cure goes well. I laid the bottom half of the mold on some sawhorses and lined it with my sheet of aluminum. The aluminum has some paste wax applied to it to act as a mold release. When I cut that strip from the center of my base, my registration pins went with it. So I'm trying a different technique I've heard about, using two binding inserts glued to the base sheet to keep the base sheet and the core aligned. Next, I got my base sheet situated in the mold. I used some masking tape to try to keep it centered and fixed in place, but that doesn't end up working too well. Then I wiped down the base and cleaned it with acetone. After that, I rolled out some VDS rubber foil strips. This is a material that gets placed over the edges of a board to help with adhesion and dampening, and helps guarantee that the board will last longer. Next, I measured my resin. I'm using the epoxy from snowboardmaterials.com, and I'm following a lot of advice that you guys gave me in the comments, splitting it into two batches, pre-measuring my part A and my part B, and using trays once the resin has been mixed. Off to the side, I've got my core, top sheets, glass cloth, and my mold and clamps all prepped, so we're ready for layup. Let's throw some gloves on, start a timer, and get mixing. The epoxy's got a 20-minute pot life, so as soon as those parts touch, we're under the gun. The first step is to wet out the base sheet with epoxy. Next, we're going to grab those rubber strips, get them covered in resin, and place them over the edges of the board. Then we lay down our first sheet of glass cloth. I need those binding inserts that I'm using for alignment to poke through the glass, so I went in and cut a couple strands with an X-Acto knife. Then I wet out the cloth, pouring resin all over and then using a squeegee to push and move it all around until the cloth was soaked through. The squeegee I'm using is just a spare piece of base material, but you can use whatever you have handy. Next, I grabbed my core and popped it onto the mold upside down. I wet out the bottom, being sure to fill in all the gaps around the binding inserts, flipped the core over, and tried to get it aligned. This was the midway point of my build, so I mixed my second batch of epoxy, and then wet out the top of the core. I placed down my second layer of glass, got it wetted out, then drop my top sheet in place. Over the top sheet, I laid down a sheet of plastic. This will prevent excess resin from seeping around or through the top sheet and bonding to the mold. And then I added this sheet of soft foam rubber. This will get squished down and help fill any gaps. I've heard of people using cork for this, the soft kind of insulation foam, yoga mats, and I'm using a really cheap surplus camping mat. Lastly, I dropped the top of my mold in place and got clamping. And honestly, at this point, I was freaking out. I was pretty sure I messed up my registration with those binding inserts. I wasn't sure if I had enough clamping pressure. The molds were cupped a little bit, and I was certain that I had ruined another board, and I had to wait 24 hours to find out one way or the other. I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I've made a lot of boards and I've made a lot of things in woodworking and craft in general over my life, and pressing a snowboard is definitely one of the most stressful ones that I've done so far. I was kind of in a really bad way for about a day there, but I went and caught a powder day at my local and came back after a stressful 24 hours and cracked open the mold. Might have the snowboard. I think it's a snowboard. I think it's a snowboard. Oh my God. Yeah, very exciting. But we can rough cut it and get a much better idea of whether everything bonded together correctly or not. So let's do that. Just a quick note, I'm using a laminate blade in my jigsaw for this, and I'd strongly recommend them. They handle composite materials much better than the standard wood blades, and they don't dull as fast. A quick inspection of the sides showed me that my glass, core, base, sidewalls, top sheet, and edges were all bonded together properly for the most part. I've got one or two small sections where the top sheet bubbled, but that should be relatively easy to repair. So sick! I have finally successfully pressed a snowboard. And it's far from perfect, but I got enough about this layup right that I am pretty confident that it'll hold up to at least a day of riding on the mountain. Which means it is more than 100% worth finishing, so that's what we're gonna do in the next video. I'm gonna put the finishing touches on this thing, put a nice finish on the top sheet, and then I guess we just have to take it for a test drive. So be sure to subscribe and stick around for that and all the other DIY board sport projects we do here on the channel. If you're interested in how I made all the different components of this board, make sure to check out the rest of the series. I've got videos on every step of the process. Leave me your questions and comments below. I do my best to get to all of them. If you want to say, hey, Chris, you did it. I did, didn't I? You know, you could say that and it would be cool. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. Your support is what allows me to tackle projects like this, so thank you so much. And you guys know I love having you along for the ride. So thank you so much for coming by, and until next time, I'll see you soon. A dream 15 years in the making. Very, very exciting. Yeah. See you guys next week. Let's get this thing on the snow.